Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It is time for the May Q&A. So we've asked you guys to give us some questions, and hopefully we're going to provide you with some good answers.
Hopefully. Fingers crossed.
Well, yeah, that's the plan. So we'll see how it goes. But before we do, today's video sponsor is Thermal Grizzly and their Cryonaut Extreme, which is now available in a 2-gram syringe. This high-performance thermal paste delivers maximum thermal conductivity thanks to an extremely small particle size and layer thickness. It's also very flexible, capable of standing up to sub-zero temperatures for extreme overclocking, but also performs exceptionally well for air and water cooling applications. So if your CPU or GPU needs repasting, then I suggest checking out the Thermal Grizzly range. Link is in the video description. Alright Tim, Ryzen gave us more cores in general, that's true. And now Intel gives us a bunch of E-cores. In today's video, you said the 2600X aged better than its competition. Do you think that'll hold true for current AMD parts? I've been PC building for a long time now, but it seems only adding more full-size cores has ever lasted the test of time. Yep, so I pretty sure it was the 1600X that I was talking about, but it's roughly the same CPU, so that's fine. And for those of you wondering, it was in relation to the Core i5 7600K. I believe that's the video we're talking about.
Yep.
So this one in general is pretty easy to answer because it's a very different situation to that first gen Ryzen versus 7th gen core series, because Alder Lake, which is the CPUs with the E-cores, they just have, well, as many or more CPU resources than Zen 3, which is why they're doing quite well in productivity now. And there is higher IPC to boot. So really, for the most part, for almost all of the matchups, Alder Lake is slightly faster and has slightly more CPU resources. So I expect those margins to remain pretty consistent well into the future. If we were to go through individual matchups, I've noted a few here. Again, Intel wins most of them. So Ryzen 5, which would be the 5600 and 5600X, against the locked Core i5 parts, so like the 12400, which is a part we really like, they're both 6-core, 12-thread. There's some discrepancies here and there with frequencies and things like that, but they're going to age the same, obviously, because they're both 6-core, 12-thread processors. The 12600K has a couple of E-cores, and that will, well, it's faster now for productivity, and it will be in the future. Ryzen 7 versus Core i7, same situation. The E-cores exist there, and again, those parts are just outright faster, so they're certainly going to age better, the Alder Lake parts. The only one which could be interesting would be, would you say, the 12900K versus the 5950X?
Yep.
Because you get 16 actual cores versus 8 P cores with 8 E-cores.
Yep.
So a different way of going about it there, and I think, honestly, I don't think it's relevant, because when a game is going to max out those CPUs, where you take advantage of having 16 full-size cores,
probably quite a way into the future, if ever.
I would honestly not predict Zen 3 to age better, even in that comparison. I would say the 1200K will remain the slightly superior CPU for gaming, and then in productivity they trade blows, and that's not going to change from what we see now. So, no, certainly a very different situation to what we saw when AMD, well, the Ryzen 5 1600, in my opinion, was very easy to predict as being a better CPU not too far down the track. It was within 2 years. I did a reevaluation, and most games, the Ryzen 5 processor was as fast or faster, and then the really heavy ones, much better frame time performance, opposed to the Core i5 7600K, because that had 4 cores with 4 threads. So you're talking about 3 times the amount of CPU resources, 50% more cores. And the reason why that was easy to predict was because in applications like Cinebench, all core workloads, the Ryzen processor was like 80% faster. So when you've got a situation where a CPU is 80% faster when fully utilized, good chance it's going to end up being the fastest CPU for pretty much all workloads before too long. So yeah, that's that one.
With no info on RDNA3 in their keynote, do you think AMD is still releasing it this year in the same time frame as Zen 4, or do you think due to the chip shortages and the recent stopgap refresh will push the release to next year? I don't think them not showing RDNA3 in the keynote has anything to do with their release timeframes. I think it's more that companies these days are realizing that you can kind of dominate the news cycle by only talking about one thing at a time. So you have your Zen 4 announcement, and then rather than, making all these other announcements at the same time, you just wait a couple weeks and then you make another announcement. And then
that's true.
Then it's AMD news, then it's AMD news, and it keeps going on.
Well, maybe AMD's finally worked that out, but AMD seems to have really struggled with that concept over the years.
Yes.
It's like they just bombard you with everything they've done on one day. Like, yeah, I don't want to rag on AMD too much here, but their strategies have been pretty bad. Or the strategies that they were going, like they wanted to release... They actually, from memory, they wanted to release the 6000. Was it?
No, it was the Zen 2 and the 5000 series GPUs on the same day.
They did that though, right? They did do that.
Did they?
I think so. And they wanted to do it again with 6000. I'm sure those reviews were all jumbled together. Let's check that quickly. All right, we're back. We quickly confirmed that. I was right. So RDNA, the original, so the 5000 series, the RX 5000 series, that launched simultaneously with Zen 2, and I remember that because it was horrific. I had to get, like, CPU testing alone is very time-consuming and very difficult, but so reviewers had to get 5000 series GPUs and 3000 series CPUs out at the same time, simultaneously, and that was just a really... I've got no other word for it. It was dumb. That was a really dumb way of launching two exciting product lines.
Yeah, you need to let your products breathe so that people can digest the information on that thing and then move to the next thing.
Yeah.
If you're releasing all your Zen 2 parts and all your 5000 series GPUs at the same time, people are like, oh, well, what am I going to read about? And people, a lot of the interesting things that are coming out get lost in all this giant cloud of information as people are like, looking at Zen 2, then looking at the GPUs and trying to figure out which parts are good. And
you end up with, we didn't rush the reviews, but you end up with rushed reviews because people are trying to cover everything. I think we prioritized the CPUs and then, I don't remember. Yep. We basically said, we're not doing that. And we picked one. And yeah, they wanted to do the same thing with the RX 6000 series and Zen 3. And my understanding was they planned on doing that, but due to logistics or whatever, it had to end up being a few weeks separate. So I don't know. AMD doesn't seem to have learned that lesson, and they seem to not really get that. So,
but maybe they've learned it.
Maybe they've learned it. We can only hope.
Because I think like I was saying, I think it benefits AMD not to talk about their two separate lines in the same presentation.
Yeah, I think so.
Because then you talk about all your AM4, well, now it's AM5 stuff, Zen 4, you go through that, you're like, here's all the things we're announcing. Then you get exactly what we've just seen, where people make their videos, you get everyone discussing it, you have your follow-up interviews with people, you have your follow-up discussion pieces, and this is kind of taken the next couple of weeks of the news cycle in that even, the past couple of days, we've seen interviews with AMD, people clarifying further things. And I think that's a really positive thing for that product line and for AMD. And then later, once that kind of dies away, people are sort of waiting again for the next piece of news. That's when you want to hit them with the next.
Yeah, it's just AMD. That's all everyone's talking about. And you forget they have competitors.
Yeah.
If you do it well, you can really do that.
And this is exactly what Nvidia has done many times. And that's why we haven't seen... Computex has never been a major event for Nvidia as is, but Nvidia always likes to have their own time and space to launch their products. So whenever there's a new generation, they're going to launch a couple of products in the one presentation, and then that's it. And then they might be back a month later to launch the next product, and then a month later for the next product, and then they keep doing that. You never see them launch the 3050, 3060, 3060 Ti all at the same time. They just don't do that.
Yeah, Nvidia's kind of good at marketing, aren't they?
They are pretty good. So, I wouldn't read into this too much. I think it's still pretty likely to be coming out this year towards the end of the year. They just want it to have their own sort of announcement because with all the rumors of it being twice as fast as the previous gen, I think it kind of deserves its own sort of announcement.
Yep, if true, for sure.
Steve, I've just finished an undervolt of my Ryzen 5800X. It's interesting to see the trend of overclocking for more performance slowly shift to undervolting for better temps and lower system noise levels. Do you prefer stock CPUs to be maxed out for power and performance, or for the manufacturers to leave headroom for enthusiast overclockers?
Well, I would rather the manufacturer get the most out of whatever it is that, especially avoiding like heavy product segmentation or leaving a lot of performance on the table that, you know, enthusiast overclockers or whatever have to unlock. So I prefer they maximize the performance out of the box, as long as that isn't it isn't like a 3090 Ti type situation where you get a little bit of extra performance for a massive increase in power usage. And we see that to a degree with the 1200KS. Yeah. I feel like the 12700K is a significantly more practical product, which is why I typically recommend that one over the 1200K, especially for gamers. So yeah, getting the most out of the product while staying pretty well in the efficiency window is the way to go. If it happens to be a situation where you can overclock a product to get 20% more performance at, you know, a 40% increase or 30% increase in power usage, then, you know, that's where overclocking does make sense, and it would make sense not to make those products. But I think from now on, we're going to see those as products, as Halo products. When you go well out of the efficiency window, that'll be your top tier product, and the stuff a step or two below that will make more sense basically across the board in terms of price, the performance per watt, all that sort of stuff. So
yeah, and I think parts need to have as much performance as makes sense to offer out of the box, as opposed to leaving heaps of overclocking headroom, because every time we've asked our audience how many people actually overclock their parts, it's definitely the minority. Most people don't overclock.
And then there will be people that say that's definitely not true, but it is definitely true. Most people don't bother with overclocking, and it's because it's really impractical for the most sense. Like for the most part, like overclocking your GPU is a bit annoying, and your wrist stability issues. You'd rather pay to have all that sorted out rather than risk crashing in games.
Yeah, like how frustrating is it when you're in the middle of like a competitive multiplayer game and you've overclocked your GPU and it crashes?
Yeah, it works 99% of the time, but then that one time you're in the heated battle and it causes a crash. So I think that's why a lot of people don't overclock. Also, it's just a lot of people aren't into overclocking. They don't want to mess around with their system. They just want it to work.
And the performance is good enough out of the box a lot of the time.
Well, you're risking stability for, at best, 10% more performance.
Yeah. What do you think about AMD's naming of the X670 Extreme chipset rather than choosing another number to differentiate it more from the standard X670 chipset? Pending details on specific boards, is the naming justified since the optional difference in PCI 5.0 versus 4.0 connectivity may be negligible in the immediate future? Standard halo effect marketing. Well, my opinion is this doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
It's a non-issue. And the reason for this, in my opinion, is that you see it's B660, isn't it?
That's
B650?
Yeah, 650 will be the next AMD chipset.
B650 and X670 are clearly differentiated because the B series only has PCI 5.0 for the SSD, the M.2 slot. X670 starts introducing it for the graphics. The advantage that the Extreme chipset brings is that you get potentially like a second PCIe times 16 slot with PCI 5.0 support. It's not that big of a feature. Not many people are going to be utilizing dual GPUs with PCI 5.0 in their system. Not a big deal. I guess it makes it slightly clearer which products are the flagship X670 products, like your MSI Godlike, those sort of products, as opposed to your more mid-range X670. But apart from that, it's like...
Yeah, I have far less issue with that. Would you rather that the Ryzen brand's established now, do they need to keep trolling with chipset names? Or would you have rather with AM5, they make it quite clear that when you give the numbers and letters that it's an AMD chipset and not maybe, was that the Intel one? Because you just made the mistake that someone who lives and breathes this stuff, you're like, so we've got B550 and then we've got B560 and now we've got B660 but then we're going to go back to B650 and it's...
That's a bigger issue than X670 Extreme.
Well, all of it is an issue for sure because the Z and the X is certainly easier. So yeah, the B series from AMD, and it's really Intel's fault. AMD's fault rather. I would rather see that addressed than anything else.
Yeah, I agree.
That's very confusing for anybody who's new to this. And I've definitely heard stories of people who have bought a B series board and they meant to get an AMD board and they bought the Intel one because the Intel ones were the newer ones and they bought the wrong board. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that's probably that common, but it's still very confusing. And
yeah,
they could have addressed that.
X670 Extreme, no issues with this. In fact, even it would actually have been better if a platform like Z690 had something like this, where you could easily differentiate between, I mean, the pricing already does this for you to some degree, but between sort of the entry-level products that kind of do not a very good job of handling the top CPUs, and then the flagship stuff that handles them well.
Are you surprised by the advancements in performance lately by AMD, Nvidia, Intel? Seems like performance is increasing compared to the stagnation of the early to mid 2010s. Certainly true. Being in the industry for many years, is it easy to see the improvements keep going? So will they? Yep. Or perhaps flatline again for a period of time before pushing the boundaries again.
I think it's pretty harsh to put Nvidia in that category because
That's
I think
true.
throughout that whole period we have seen pretty strong gains from Nvidia each generation. Even a fairly weak gen like Turing did have the 2080 Ti, which was faster than the 1080 Ti. But if we look at like Intel versus AMD, I think it just comes down to competition. Intel had no competition, so there was no incentive for them to do things like increase core count or really push the boundaries of IPC, because if they get the whole market used to 5-10% gains per year, then they can just get away with it because there's no one else doing anything. So they can just, keep making the high core count parts server parts or high-end desktop parts and call it a day. It's only really since AMD's been competitive that each company has tried to push the boundaries more. And that's why competition is so important for the industry.
Yeah, that it's definitely true. They did make, because we saw them tack on 2 extra cores with the 8700K and then do it again with the 9900K. And they could have really done that at pretty well any point in time of that 14 nanometer. I mean, they did refine the process to make it a little more possible. And you could argue that it wasn't exactly practical given how much power they used, but they were forced to do something opposed to just, here's another quad core with, hyper-threading, enjoy. Also, to elaborate upon that, they were stuck. So competition or no competition, they were stuck. And it may have taken them till now to produce something like Alder Lake. So I'm not sure how fast-tracked, let's say, Alder Lake would have been, but I'm certainly wouldn't have seen the 8700K and the 9900K.
Yeah, and I mean, if Alder Lake was produced earlier than it was, it probably would have had a different technology mix. Things like DDR5 probably wouldn't have been ready if it was released several years ago. But this whole question just comes down to competition creates this. And, will we keep seeing big gains each generation or stagnation? I mean, I think it's probably optimistic to expect huge gains every single generation. I think these things tend, aside from major issues with process tech, there tends to be some generations where you see lesser gains than other generations. That's fairly common. You see, especially when they move up to a new process node. Typically, you'd see more substantial gains than if they're using the same process node, but then AMD's also been able to achieve big gains on the same nodes. So, maybe there'll be some stagnation in the future, but I certainly don't think we'll see another period of like 5 years.
No, well, there's competition, especially the really heated competition we're seeing in CPUs now. There will not be stagnation. Sure, the jumps may not be as big because both companies have got the most out of basically their current architectures, so it's refinements at this point and process node improvements. But we're not going to see same core count, basically no IPC improvement, and then the improvement of 5% comes through squeezing a few more megahertz out of them. Don't think that's going to happen anytime soon while they're both really competitive. Okay, Tim, I think we sort of had a similar question to this, I think only last month, but I'll read it out and see what you think. If the rumor for the 4000 series from Nvidia is arriving in July instead of September or October pans out to be true, where does that leave Intel Arc? So we've already talked about these GPUs, in our opinion, just being way too late in the game.
Yeah, and I think again, we have no idea. We're not under NDA or anything, or we don't know whether they're coming in July or not. So no idea whether that's true or not. But it's kind of just, it's basically exactly what we were talking about last month in terms of, they're kind of getting really close to the next gen GPUs. And then if NVIDIA's series comes out in July, it's pretty likely that they'd be launching it basically the same time. Which is probably not what Intel was hoping for.
No, they're really going to be budget GPUs now. Like what they were hoping to be sort of their mid-tier RTX 3070 competitor is going to become more of an entry-level product.
Yeah, and they'll have a lot of implications for pricing. I would have thought, like maybe they originally thought, oh, we could launch our best Arc GPU for, let's say, $450 to $500 because we think it can compete with the 3070.
Because a year ago, it could have been $800.
Yeah, and now it's like, well, maybe we can only charge $350 or $400 for that GPU. And yeah, as you say, it could have been $800 a year ago. So they've kind of gone from, if they had launched, especially towards the end of 2021, when GPUs were extremely unavailable, that was like the golden window for Intel Arc to launch. People were desperate for GPUs. You could just, I'll buy anything. I'll literally buy anything.
The drivers could have worked in half the games.
Yeah, and people would be like,
and they'd just clear their inventory straight away.
Oh, something's available? I'll buy that. Whereas now it's like, not only are they launching in a period where availability is decent and a lot of cards are at the MSRP, especially in this sort of price range, they're coming up against next gen. So I think it's a pretty big fail.
Yeah, I mean, we won't get sort of mid-range to low-end next gen GPUs probably till next year, I would expect, potentially. So there's a little bit more of a window there, but it's still way too close.
It still reduces the prices that they can charge, which is not good for them.
Yeah, well, again, even the current generation GPUs like, the RTX 3070, well, that's probably a bad example because that hasn't fallen as much, but it's going down.
Yeah.
But RDNA2 GPUs now are, what, MSRP? Some are creeping below.
6700 XT, $480 is possible, and that sort of, sets the bar for a 3070-like product from Intel. So, yeah.
All right, on many places, I'm starting to see people recommend 32GB of RAM over 16GB for gaming. What are your thoughts on this? Is 16GB era ending? Is it ending? Are we no longer recommending 16GB of memory, Tim? I think 16GB for most games, most instances, would be fine. Certainly not optimal, but it'd be fine. I don't think you'd be sacrificing any real performance or... Again, it depends on the game. We have seen instances where I think Microsoft Flight Simulator, not that that's necessarily a game, but it's an example where that was very memory intense. I think probably the Call of Duty games are pretty bad as well, or use a lot of memory. But I think the easiest way to answer the question is you're paying about, I think, $60-ish US for 16GB of memory, and then two 16 gigabyte modules for a 32GB capacity is just over $100. It's about twice the price, but I think the main thing is it's such an insignificant cost given you'll be paying twice that for a sort of mid-ish range entry-level CPU. I mean, what's a decent motherboard these days? Most people probably pay around $150 for a decent motherboard. So spending $100, $110 on 32GB of memory, you might as well just do that to ensure that you don't run out of memory because that will start to impact performance and the experience. So for an extra $6, even if you were buying one kit and then another kit, it's an extra $60, maybe $70 on the higher side for some decent quality stuff. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's probably you stick with 16 gig for like your budget entry-level systems.
Entry-level,
But I think if you're sort of looking at decent quality like Core i5, Ryzen 5 and above, especially if you've got a decent GPU, then $60 sort of difference.
Might as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely, especially if you're doing other things outside of gaming that may use a bit of memory. It just
the famous Google Chrome memory usage.
Yeah, I mean, if memory was still like $200 for 16 and then having to spend $400, something crazy like that, even $300, then maybe not worth it for most users. But yeah, $60, $70, you might as well just double your memory capacity and ensure that you don't run into any problems.
Yep.
After seeing your original review on how cache helps, I was going to say cache, with Intel parts, and now the review of the 5800X 3D, I could see the companies starting to find ways to get as much cache as possible in a CPU. At what point do you suspect diminishing returns? If they manage to put a gig of cache in the CPU, would the performance uplift continue to scale on most games, or would you start to see a notice to diminishing returns? Certainly, I think you would start to see a diminishing returns there. Again, we have limited data to call on here, but even with the Intel video I did, we did see when you started to get down to like 4-core CPUs that the performance uplift from the much larger L3 cache pool was less than what you would see with 8 cores and 10 cores. So there is evidence there that you need the workload to utilize more cores and, of course, have the more cores available for that huge L3 cache to be of benefit. And then, yeah, so it's sort of, there's multiple things going on there. There's the workload, and then there's the CPU resources. And, of course, we're not going to see companies doing that anyway because it's expensive.
That's pretty much.
So I think
a gig of cache, at least on current fab technologies, pretty pricey.
The diminishing returns would be seen in price before performance, I would have thought.
Yeah, that's right. And even with your 5800X 3D testing, there was still quite a range of performance results that were possible.
Yes.
You'd expect that games where we were seeing the largest performance benefits could potentially benefit even more from larger cache.
Yes.
Because if you're seeing like a 40% gain, then what could have been the gain if the cache was then doubled further?
Yes.
But games where you're seeing like a 5% performance difference.
Which did happen a lot.
Yeah, like a lot of those games probably not going to benefit too much more from the extra cache. So memory's always important for games, but I think AMD would have known sort of what's the sort of sweet spot for these sort of things when developing this sort of product.
Definitely. Yeah, well, I mean, we did see performance gains of like 50%, which is, staggering. But on average, if you have 20 plus games compared to a Zen 3 CPU without Vcache, it was like 15%.
Which is still good.
15, 20, well, really good.
Really good, yeah.
Depending on the price difference, of course. Yep. But what that indicates is there's a lot of games that do see smaller performance gains. Yep. I actually really like this question here that we got on our Discord. Is good one to discuss, I think. So basically, how do you feel about companies using your work like this? And we'll provide a screenshot on screen so you guys can see what they're talking about. To be clear, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Just want to know if you have a say in it and your thoughts. So typically we do have a say in it. Generally what happens is a company, I think it was AMD in this example, the Radeon division. But in that instance, AMD did approach us and they said, is it okay if we, highlight your results in this video or whatever? And basically they're sort of like, what does it cost to do that? Because apparently that the industry standard has been to charge for that sort of stuff in the past. We don't charge for that, to be clear. So any companies that use any screen grabs or clips or whatever from our videos, that is free to use. Basically, my take personally is it's already out there. It's public what I've said. So if they want to use that for their marketing or whatever, I don't really have a problem with it as long as nothing's taken out of context. Like they're not chopping down quotes or sentences to make it sound like we're saying something's brilliant when we weren't really saying that. Yeah. So for me, it's pretty simple. It's already in the public domain. We've said what we've said. If that's a benefit of them and they want to use it, well, I mean, I don't really.
Yeah, we don't get anything out of it.
We're not getting anything out of it. It's not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're talking about with the paid side of things is really important because I don't like the idea of paying for quotes because...
Well, it just incentivizes you to give them quotes.
It's like, oh, well, if I said this catchy thing in my review that makes the product look really good, then I know the company's going to come to me and be like, hey, we want to use that and we'll pay you for it. And I don't like that idea. No. I want whatever I say to be my opinions, not have it influenced by that side of things. So I'm very much for allowing companies to use it for free. And I know for a fact this is not the way the industry works and that the majority of quotes used for marketing are paid, which is unfortunate, but...
Maybe not necessarily for YouTubers.
It depends on the industry, but certainly back in the days when we were doing, working more on the written media side of things.
It's very, very common.
Very, very common.
Yep. And TechSpot didn't charge for that either.
Yes. But I think it really comes down to the pay. It's free for companies, and we don't restrict any. If any company comes to us and is like, "We want to use this," we're almost always going to grant use.
Yeah.
So
as long as it's the context all. Yep. They're not misrepresenting our work.
So most companies over the years have approached us for quotes, which we've granted. There's been maybe a few instances where we've had to say, well, that's not really what we were saying or whatever. Yeah. But there are some, and I think a lot of the points that people make about this is that there are some companies that simply use our quotes more than others. AMD tends to use our quotes quite a lot.
Nvidia does as well.
Nvidia has used them, but I would say that Intel very rarely uses our quotes, even though there have been many instances where we have praised Intel products in a similar way to how we've praised AMD products. It's just about how they go about it and the publications that they like and trust. So yeah, you would have seen, for example, Nvidia on their DLSS page, as many people have talked about, has a quote from us talking about how DLSS is good. That quote was provided for free for Nvidia to use. They asked us. I'm like, you're not taking it out of context, so that's fine. And that's how it goes. So if there's any companies watching and wanting to know how our quote process works, very simple. So yeah, we tend not to have an issue with this. I think some people sort of look at them and say, oh, you know, what's going on there? Was that like a paid ad, or, you know, are they sort of using your videos without your permission? And there are some instances I've seen things being linked to without asking. But
which, again, I don't really have a problem with. They don't need to run it by us. If it's not taken out of context, I don't really care. There has been instances where they wanted to re-upload our video to other platforms to share it there, and we're like, no, you can't do that. But, you know, clips, what would, I suppose, come under fair use is fine.
Yes. So, yeah, that's pretty much it with these sort of circumstances. So if you ever see one of our videos being retweeted or a quote or a link from a company, that's sort of the process that we take.
Yeah, I think I'd rather just a quote and a link, and that's fine, rather than clips, because it does look like we are representing that company.
Yes.
Especially to people who aren't familiar with what we do. It looks like, you know, we're shilling for that company, which is definitely not the case. Yep. So, yeah, I'd rather they didn't do that. But anyway.
It is what it is, I guess.
Yeah.
With AMD now including iGPUs on their CPUs moving forward with AM5, how do you think this could affect Premiere specifically? Intel have QuickSync, which helps out quite a lot for Premiere users. So will AMD benefit from the same advantage now? So, bit of an interesting question. It really depends on sort of your setup for these sort of things, because Premiere, you know, if you have a discrete GPU, it'll prioritize using the discrete GPU's encoding capability. So if you've got an Nvidia GPU, most likely it will be doing its encoding not using QuickSync, but using NVENC instead, because the GPU is much more powerful. But there are some circumstances where it can use both at the same time, depending on Premiere, you know, is maybe not great for this. I know DaVinci Resolve will use them more significantly and will use them both simultaneously. So that's kind of where you get the sort of minor uplift from using QuickSync. Maybe use QuickSync for decoding while the GPU is being used for encoding. It just depends. I think this will have more of an impact for people that are just using the integrated graphics, or maybe had an AMD CPU but a very low-end GPU that's perhaps not particularly powerful. Having that benefit for all AMD CPUs having some sort of encoding capability is going to be beneficial in some circumstances. But again, most modern platforms have some form of encoder available, even laptops. You know, most of the time there's going to be something there to be used. So I think this is more going to come down to how Adobe optimizes their software, because I think it's much more optimized for QuickSync and NVENC than it is for AMD's encoder, and works a lot better on those platforms. So it's probably more of an Adobe issue than an AMD issue. Yeah,
and look, the integrated graphics is primarily to make it useful for business type stuff. Like that's where Intel's stuff's really appealing, because you don't need a discrete GPU. AMD struggled to break into those markets because they don't have.
Yeah, and you know, it's going to support AV1 decoding, so that's going to help for things like YouTube, watching YouTube videos on basically every platform. Doesn't matter what GPU you have, that's something that will be supported. But again, lots of GPUs these days have these features as well. So
yeah, it just makes it a more flexible product. You could,
that's right.
For business users, home theater PCs, you don't have to seek out an APU, for example.
Yep. What the hell is going on with Nvidia's ReBar support? There are plenty of games that perform better with ReBar enabled via the third-party profile inspector software, yet the official list hasn't grown. Has Nvidia given up on whitelisting games? I mean, seems that way.
Nvidia's ReBar support was weird from the get-go, and it just doesn't seem to have improved. I've got nothing for you on that one. It makes no sense to me whatsoever, because there's performance to be had there. They want to win benchmarks.
It kind of feels like they were checking off a checklist of supported features for competition purposes. Like, you know, oh, AMD's got this feature, let's make our equivalent, check the box, and then that's it.
Yeah, I get they don't want to make... Well, resizable bar is not really an AMD feature.
It's not, but you know what I mean, right? Like AMD's advertising it.
But again, I get that, but that would be way too petty to the point where, because it doesn't make sense. Like, if they can get 5%, 10% better performance in Forza Horizon 5 or Horizon Zero Dawn, or pick a game where, you know, resizable bar is of benefit, they want to win benchmarks, which is kind of like the whole reason why ray tracing and DLSS, you know, Nvidia would absolutely love nothing more in life than all reviewers to enable the highest level of ray tracing at any game that supports it, and DLSS, for example, and show them just smashing the graphs.
I think they want features that they can market. And I think ray tracing and DLSS and the general performance is much easier to market than being like, well, you know, some of the time you can, you know, our ReBar support gives you 3% better performance. I think they're kind of beyond that level of
I mean,
nitpicking over their things.
I know for a fact they want to win benchmarks. So therefore, it's strange and doesn't make sense to me.
I guess maybe they just don't think it's that important. Like if they're already getting heaps of sales from DLSS and ray tracing support and
maybe they
generally
just don't
being
care.
faster, they're like, we've already got all of our marketing points that we need. We're going to talk about RTX. We're going to talk about having the fastest GPU. Beyond that, you know, we're good.
Yeah, it's interesting because it can be completely external from AMD. If you're an Nvidia user and you have an Alder Lake CPU, for example, the performance gains there from actually having working resizable bar are quite substantial, or can be in certain titles. So I think Nvidia are doing themselves and their users a bit of a disservice there by not taking advantage of that. But why that is, can't answer the question. Makes no sense to me whatsoever.
All right, we're going to hit pause for part 1 of the Q&A. We're only about halfway through the questions, so we're expecting to have a part 2 up on the channel probably tomorrow, if not within a couple of days. But yeah, lots of good questions so far. I've really enjoyed answering the questions as always with my pal Steve over here. What else is there? If you're interested in supporting the channel, we do have Patreon and Floatplane. We just did a whole bunch of live streams. One of them you would have seen on the main channel, which was our charity stream with Child's Play. Definitely check that out if you missed it. But apart from that, we also did our monthly Patreon and Floatplane live stream. And then as well, Steve decided to set up his gaming PC, do some streaming.
We did a test stream.
Destroyed some haters in Fortnite, which was good. And
yeah,
I enjoyed watching that. So yeah, lots of fun. So those are all the perks you can get if you're a Hardware Unboxed community member, plus lots of other stuff as well, Discord chat and everything.
I have a streaming hangover today.
Yeah, so definitely a lot of fun. I think
really great day.
Yeah, hopefully you'll be doing a few more gaming streams in the future, which will be a bit of fun. But anyway, that's it for this one. We're going to catch you in part 2 very shortly. But until then, I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
I'll see you in the next one.